Hello, and welcome to another interview in our series of Let's Talk podcasts. From substance use prevention to quality research, treatment of addiction and recovery from it, these award-winning podcasts focus on the issues of importance to Hazel and Betty Ford, issues that we know matter to you too. I'm your host, William C. Moyers, and yes, it looks a little different around the studio these days. How can it not? As we all know, a lot has changed in the world since our last round of podcast interviews back in the winter of 2020. Hazel and Betty Ford take seriously the need to do everything possible to prevent the spread of coronavirus among our patients and our employees. Even here in this studio, we are following public health guidelines. As a result, I don't need my mask for this interview because the production crew, the executive producer, and yes, even our guest are elsewhere in the building. In the circles of recovery, there is an oft-repeated phrase, from adversity comes opportunity. Jessica Hernandez certainly proves this. She's an addiction counselor for Hazel and Betty Ford, based in St. Paul, and she's worked for us for about 3 years after graduating with her master's from the Hazel and Betty Ford Graduate School of Addiction Studies. Hers is a story of the opportunity that comes from adversity. Hers is a story of hope. Jessica, welcome to Let's Talk.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
What is hope, Jessica?
I think for me, it's just this feeling that comes inside, that I didn't initially have. I never knew what that was. And until one day, we were talking about this in group yesterday, you have this moment that clicks and you just know. And it's just something that breathes inside of me. And today I'm able to look for it outside of myself and look for it in other people. I see that every day with clients who walk in, who get sober and who maintain sobriety, who I see, out in the community and who are doing incredible things. These patients who have worked really hard to change their life. To me, like the hope started, with me internally, and now I get to see it everywhere.
Once upon a time, you were hopeless. Tell us about those times.
I was really hopeless. I remember these moments where I, initially, essentially was planning my own death and was really okay with that. And, I just thought if this is as good as it got, I didn't want this anymore. I was ready for something different. And if that meant that an ending had to come, then an ending had to come. And I remember praying to whoever it was out there because I didn't really know what I believed. I know what I'd been taught, but didn't know what I believed. And just saying, please just end this. I'm just ready for this to be over. And about 3 weeks later, I got the answer that I was not looking for. It was a car accident while being in a blackout. And everything changed from there.
So you have a history, part of your story is about being a young woman struggling with a substance use disorder.
Yes, I was very much in my addiction when these times were not, when this hopeless feeling was going on. I was, the alcohol, when you get to a place where it doesn't work. And I remember clearly when it stopped working, all the things that I was putting in my body stopped working. And, I was no longer able to just pass out or fade away into the universe like I liked to do. I was very much still present in this hopeless feeling, in this really depressing state. It was all around me all the time, and the substances no longer took it away. And there was nothing more defeating than that because there was no other solution that I had. I had no other coping skills. And so, but luckily, I had this random, unfortunate good luck incident that ended up changing my life.
From adversity comes opportunity. Now, I want to come back to that in a couple of minutes, but let's talk a little bit more about your struggles as a young woman with substances. How old were you when you first began to experiment with substances?
I was 12 years old when I had my first drink. I'm sure I had sips of alcohol around, from family members prior to that, but nothing, the moment where I had my first drink and got the feeling that I continuously searched for was 12 years old. I was at a sleepover with a friend, and her parents had a bar that I would have been proud to have as an alcoholic. I was, and I remember she grabbed something that was brown, poured out half a Coke and filled the rest of the Coke with whatever it was, because I don't even know what we were drinking. And she passed it around. And, after we started taking drinks from it, I remember getting a warm feeling and thinking, and never in my life having felt that connected to people. I just felt so comfortable. I felt like I was part of, all those really normal alcoholic things that we say. I didn't feel comfortable until then. To me, this was like the feeling that I was going to continuously look for, because for the first time in my life, everything was calm.
So it worked for a while.
It did. It absolutely worked for a while. And, I wasn't able to stay drunk at 12 years old. My parents were very involved in my life, and they, they're Latin parents. They were with me all the time and constantly watching out. But at 14, it definitely picked up again. And I was, I was doing anything I could to find ways to sneak around the rules my parents had set in order to be able to do the things I wanted to do.
And then, of course, you spiraled down like we all do when we can't control our use. Did you ever try to control your use?
I did. It was in my 20s. I remember, if I only smoke weed, then I won't have to drink. If I drink water in between every drink, I'm going to give up alcohol for Lent. And, all the things that were able to prove to me in that moment that I was okay, that because I could control it like this, there was nothing wrong with it. There were times where it worked for a little while. And then inevitably, just like something happened and it was no longer working.
And then you had your bottom, and what was your bottom, as we say?
Yes, I did have my bottom. I think my bottom really started before the actual accident. My bottom again started, as I was praying for things to end, because I was just so miserable and nothing was helping. And then I got my answer, and I was involved in a car accident while in a blackout. And I remember in the holding cell after the hospital, I was in there and I thought, okay, I was working as a social worker at a high school, and I thought, they're going to fire me for sure, and this is the answer. I've been so stressed out. That's the reason this is all happening. And I continue to walk, I'm pacing in the cell, and finally I hear this voice in my head that says, you're an alcoholic. You can't drink anymore. And for just a second, I saw this field of grass and flowers popped out, and all this is happening in my head. And for a long time, I didn't tell anybody about that incident, because I thought, well, I'm really crazy. I'm hearing things, I'm seeing things, and this isn't a normal situation. But in that moment, in that holding cell, it's like everything was wiped away. I just felt so good. And of course, 3 minutes later, the addiction starts talking and says, don't tell anybody else this. You're not going to be able to drink anymore if you do. But in that moment, that's where the hope really started. That's where the seed was planted for that things could be different and things could be better. And
was treatment part of your early steps in recovery?
It was. I was very fortunate to be able to go to Hazelden Center City. I was a patient on DLN, and it was an amazing experience. I got there and I wasn't an alcoholic because, again, my addiction was saying don't tell anybody. And I think after the first week, my counselor said, okay, well, you're here and you're not an alcoholic, and we need to figure out what you're doing here then. And she gave me the weekend to think to ask other people how they came to the conclusions they were alcoholics. And over that weekend, I did exactly what she told me not to, and said, do you think I'm an alcoholic? Because that's what I heard. And so I asked the women on my unit, who were so wonderful, and they didn't tell me what I was or what I wasn't. One of them said, I don't know many normal drinkers who are in residential treatment questioning whether they're alcoholics after having a car accident like you did, but hey, I don't know. And so through that night, I think I went to the lecture hall and in Bigelow, and I heard a gentleman share his story, and we hear them share our story, and he didn't just share my story of like the alcoholic feelings and all that. He shared exactly what I had done, and he also worked at a school, and I remember he probably had almost 4 years sober, and he said, "And I'm okay today." And for me, being okay today was the biggest gift that I could have ever asked for. I just wanted to be okay. And to hear him say that was huge and changed everything. And I went back to the unit, and as we did our process after lecture, I shared with my peers, I'm an alcoholic. It was the first time I said it out loud to a group of people, and everyone just cheered. They were
Go figure, right?
They were just so excited. Yes. And I was like, well, that's crazy. And I remember, after that, we would do our gratitudes every night. And one of the gratitudes I had, which was such a big deal for me, was that I was really grateful that I had this accident, and I was really grateful no one was seriously hurt and I didn't have to do anything more, because I could start seeing that moment that this was really something that was going to change everything for me.
And yet, there's a twist in your story, because you had your car accident, you went to treatment, you heard what you needed to hear to accept that you were alcoholic, you found recovery, you had a couple of years, I believe, and then something happened.
Yes. So I had a couple of years before, I was going to meetings, I was really involved in my group, I was continuing to go return to Hazelden for reunions and do all the recovery fun stuff. And my court date was finally set, and it was a long process, as the court system tends to do. And I think I was almost a year and a half sober when I started going to court for my hearings that kept getting pushed back. And finally at 2 years, they came up with a deal, and they had initially offered me 20 years. And
20 years in prison?
Yes, concurrently, because I hit a police car that was on the side of the road answering the call of a reckless driver who was me. And so in that town, I know how fortunate and lucky I am. Right before I went to court, there was another gentleman who had his 4th DWI and was out on a bond and had hit and killed a police officer while out on that bond, which is, I just feel for that, because I know that really could have easily been me. But again, it didn't have to be. And so, yeah, they were going tough on me. And honestly, by the time I got to that point of court, and I remember having to go in for an interview for probation because it was still an option with the deal that they had given me. And the officer asked, what do you want to happen to you? And I remember having had worked with my sponsor for so long to be ready for this moment. And, and she had me praying for months that I would be willing to do whatever it took to make it right, regardless of what happened. Her prayer worked. This prayer worked, because that's what happens when you are connected and you're using these tools. And I got in there and I just said, I don't know what should happen to me. I have ideas, but I know that I've lost that privilege. And I also know that if something happened to my sister or my nieces or my family, I would want consequences for the person, and I believe in consequence. And so they ended up sentencing me to 2 years in prison. And again, just like the rest of my story, where I have all these random moments of just blessings that are given to me, I was released after 6 months. My dad had spoken to the DA and just said, I know you were doing your job and we thank you. And my daughter has really changed through this. And I just want to thank you, and I want to let you know she really is a different person, and we're grateful for that. And the DA said, okay, I've done my job and you can get her out, and here's how. And my dad advocated for me and did whatever it took, and I was able to be released on a probation after that.
Wow. And then, of course, you found your calling, if you will. You moved from Texas up to Minnesota. So you're a native Texan like I am, and we did find redemption and the opportunity to give back here in the state of Minnesota. You became an addictions counselor. You got your master's in addiction studies. Wow.
Yep. I don't know how I work like every day to be worthy of this life that I've been given, because I know that this is not what everybody gets in addiction, and not everybody gets doing the things that I was doing. And I'm so grateful that I hope that everybody gets to find their, their magical experience. And that doesn't mean that, life is always peachy and, rainbows, but it, I have so many tools and so many wonderful people around me who have constantly supported me through this journey that I don't find it necessary to resort to anything that I used to use, because I know that this is the easier way for me today.
And then from adversity comes the opportunity not only to find recovery for yourself, but to give back through your professional role at Hazel and Betty Ford in St. Paul. Incredible. Before we close, we just have a minute or two. I really appreciate you sharing your story with our audiences. I know people will be inspired, because yours is a story of hope. Do you share your story with the patients that are under your care?
No. I really try and separate that. I do lecture, and so through lectures, when you're lecturing about the steps, we all have shared pieces of our story, but I've never shared anything in detail. If they know that I've had legal issues, because that's how I'll describe it, like I've talked about legal issues and this is what we do. They try and come up with what did she do? And so that's always fun to hear what they think I did. Right. But no, I don't. I typically don't share it. I really try and make it about them. And, I do try and share the hope that I've found. And it's being in St. Paul, living in St. Paul, working in St. Paul. It's a small community. Mm-hmm. And so I tend to run into people in the community and meetings and such. And so they get to hear pieces, something that I might share, that they get to hear that. And so they definitely know I'm in recovery. And I think there are moments where maybe it helps, and there are moments where, mm-hmm. I don't know. But I try to keep it as professional as I can.
Last question. There will be people watching this podcast that are seeking to not only know more about you, but to find out how you did it as it relates to their own struggles. In other words, there'll be a lot of members of our audience who will be hopeless or looking for hope. What is your message to people who are listening or watching you today and are without hope?
My message is, this is probably going to be the hardest thing you ever do, and it's going to be the most rewarding thing. I know that I visualized this life that I wanted to have, right? I visualized all these things that happened when I first got sober, and even before that, and I just asked for what I needed. What I needed was this to change and this to end, and the universe showed up for me in a really incredible way, and it wasn't the way that I thought it was going to look. However, I know the gifts I got from that, and none of this was easy. But it was incredibly worth it, and things just keep getting better. They just keep getting better. My family relationships get better. Relationships with others gets better, and so you just keep going. I promise you, it will be worth it in the end. But it's going to take time, and have fun. That's what you got to do.
Well, thanks for taking the time today to be with us, and thank you for being a messenger of hope and help and healing to other people who need and deserve exactly what we have. Thank you, Jessica Hernandez, for joining us today, and thanks to all of you for joining us. Be sure to tune in again for another edition of our regular podcasts, Let's Talk. On behalf of our executive producer, Lisa Stengel, and our podcast team from Blue Moon Productions in the Twin Cities, we want to remind you to stay safe, stay healthy in these times and in all times. We'll see you again.